What would you do if everything you fought for just disappeared? Imagine surviving the hell of World War II, the bombs exploding next to you, friends dying in your arms, the biting cold of the European trenches, all supported by a single hope, returning home to the arms of those you love. This is the true story of Captain Thomas Sullivan, a man who looked death in the eye for 937 consecutive days as the world burned around him. Each night, when the other soldiers gave up hope, Tommy took that worn photo out of his pocket. Sarah, his wife, waiting for him in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That smile, those eyes, were the only light that guided him through the darkness of war. "When I come back," he promised his companions, while touching his ring hanging next to his dog tag, "I'm going to hug you so tight that all these years of absence will simply disappear." But there is something that war does not teach soldiers, as they freeze time in their minds, replaying the same memories to stay sane. The world keeps spinning. People move on. Lives transform. What happens when you survive the impossible, only to discover that your place in the world no longer exists? How do you react when the door you've kept in your dreams for years finally opens, but reveals a nightmare? Pay attention now, because what happened to Tommy in that White House on Harbor Drive isn't just a war story. It's a devastating testimony about loss, betrayal, and the true price of heroism that no one tells. The young men marching into battle. Can you imagine what he felt when, after crossing the ocean and half the country, he climbed those 3 wooden steps, adjusted his uniform for the 10th time, and finally rang the doorbell of the house that had filled his dreams for almost 3 years? The sound of that bell wasn't just a call, it was the end of a journey, and the beginning of another much more painful one. Because when that door opened, before I show you what Tommy found, let me ask you, what would you expect after so much sacrifice? What would be fair to a man who faced the worst of humanity to protect his country, his home, his love? War turns men into heroes, but what few know is that it also turns heroes into ghosts, people displaced in time, struggling to recognize a world that has moved on without them. And what Tommy Sullivan discovered that day would forever change not only his life, but our understanding of what it truly means to come home. Each returning soldier carries a unique story of survival and hope. Your story deserves to be shared and recognized. By clicking the like button now, you honor not only Captain Sullivan's journey, but that of thousands of veterans whose stories remain in the shadows. Your like turns this narrative into a beacon that reaches other hearts that need to hear this truth. What decision would you make in Captain Sullivan's shoes? The war had changed him in ways he didn't even recognize, and now, standing at that door, he was about to face his toughest battle. His thinking connects our community and shows veterans that their experiences matter to us all. Share in the comments how you would react in this devastating situation. You have demonstrated that you are someone who values stories that transform our understanding of sacrifice and loyalty. Be part of this community that reveals the untold truths of American history and ensure immediate access to the next revelations that will change your perception of the true cost of heroism. Subscribe to our channel now to find out what happened when that door opened. What would you do if everything you fought for just disappeared? Imagine surviving the hell of World War II, the bombs exploding next to you, friends dying in your arms, the biting cold of the European trenches, all supported by a single hope, returning home to the arms of those you love. This is the true story of Captain Thomas "Tommy" Sullivan, a man who looked death in the eye for 937 consecutive days as the world burned around him. In every second of those days, he carried something heavier than his military equipment, the promise to return alive, with second-degree burns on his left arm and invisible scars on his soul. Tommy traveled exactly 4,137 miles to meet Sarah, the woman who swore to wait for him at the White House at 1424 Harbor Drive in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Every mile was a victory against the death that lurked in the European trenches. Sarah's ring, which Tommy wore on a Edie chain around his neck next to his dog tag, was rung exactly 86 times on the day he finally landed on American soil. An almost superstitious ritual that kept him sane during the unspeakable horrors he witnessed. For him, that simple golden circle was more valuable than all the medals the government could award him. When the bombs fell, he told a companion on the eve of his return, I closed my eyes and saw her face. When the cold froze our bones, I felt her warmth when I thought I wouldn't survive. It was the promise of returning to her that kept me going. The train that brought him back crossed 7 states, At each station, families welcomed their heroes with tears, hugs, and colorful posters. Tommy watched through the window, imagining what his own reunion would be like. He mentally rehearsed each word, each gesture. He planned to hug Sarah for exactly 2 minutes, enough time to make up for 937 days of forced absence. But when he finally walked through the portal with the blue hydrangeas she loved so much, the scene he witnessed was more devastating than the piled-up bodies he saw on the beaches of Sicily, more painful than the bomb that almost took his life in Monte Cassino. What Tommy found when he walked through that door would break not only his heart but also his understanding of what it means to fight, survive, and ultimately return home. Because sometimes the real battlefield isn't in the trenches of war, it's in the places we call home. Now, before you continue, ask yourself, what is worth defending when everything you love no longer exists? What if what kept him alive throughout the war was just an illusion? On each of the 29 battlefields where he fought, as bombs fell like merciless rain around him, Tommy murmured a single name as if it were a protective incantation. Sarah. It wasn't just a name. It was a talisman against horror, an anchor in reality when the madness of war threatened to swallow him whole. On the darkest nights, when the silence was almost as terrifying as the bombings, he repeated like a prayer the address that symbolized all that was good and true in the world. 1424 Harbor Drive, Bridgeport, Connecticut. Each syllable was a reminder that there was a place where bombs didn't fall, where no enemies lurked, where the smell was not of gunpowder and death but of freshly baked apple pie. While his comrades slowly succumbed to cheap alcohol and corrosive despair, Tommy resisted. In the flickering light of the makeshift fire pits, he proudly held up Sarah's faded and crumpled photo, her smile frozen in time, preserved beneath the cracked glass of her pocket photo frame. "This is my reason for returning alive," he said with an unwavering conviction that made even the most skeptical and hardened soldiers believe that perhaps there was something worthwhile in the post-war world. The 43 letters he managed to send amid the chaos, written with trembling hands by candlelight, sometimes stained with mud from the trenches, always ended with the same solemn promise, almost a sacred oath. "I will return home to your arms, even if it is my last act on this earth." Words that sustained him when his body wanted to give up, when his companions fell beside him, when the world seemed consumed by endless darkness. When the ship finally docked in New York, Tommy felt the weight of nearly 3 years begin to dissolve. The Statue of Liberty wasn't just a monument, it was a portal to a world where he could go. Back to just being Thomas Sullivan, not Captain Sullivan, not Soldier 47892, not the man who had to do unspeakable things to survive. The train that took him across America seemed to move too slowly. Each station was an unnecessary stop. Each stop was an eternity. When he finally arrived at the Bridgeport station, his knees nearly gave out. There it was, so close that I could taste happiness. Tommy's heart almost exploded when the bus dropped him off just 3 blocks from home. He dispensed with taxis. He wanted to feel every step of the way. He wanted his feet to reconnect with American soil, with the streets of his city. With every step, he could have sworn he smelled the cinnamon rolls Sarah used to bake on Sundays, the distant scent of his childhood and youth, the scent of normalcy after years of unbearable smells. But as he walked the familiar streets of Bridgeport, something began to change. Have you ever had that mysterious feeling, that inexplicable feeling that comes out of nowhere and squeezes your chest? Like a seasoned soldier, Tommy learned to trust his instincts. They kept him alive when logic failed him. And now, those same instincts sounded a silent alarm. Imagine, what would you do if you were in Tommy's shoes? If after surviving the unthinkable, when they returned home, they realized that something fundamental had changed. Share in the comments how you would react to this distressing premonition, to this feeling that the battle may not be over. What would Tommy find around the corner on Harbor Drive? Would the home you preserved intact in your memory still exist? Would Sarah have waited, as she promised on that last morning of 1942? The answer was just a few steps away, and it would change everything forever. Autumn leaves danced on the Bridgeport sidewalks as Tommy walked the last few blocks to his house. The same street, the same trees, but something hung in the air, a subtle dissonance that only a man trained to detect danger could perceive. Like that silence that precedes an ambush, a silence that screams for those who know how to listen. When Tommy passed by the residence of Mrs. Jenkins, the 78-year-old neighbor who always greeted him with a warm smile and oatmeal cookies, she was raking leaves from her porch. Her eyes met his for a second, recognition, surprise, and then something else, something that made his stomach tighten. The elderly woman quickly looked away, her movements becoming erratic, hurried, and entered the house, closing the door with unnecessary force. It was as if she had seen a ghost, and maybe it had. Mr. Patterson was arranging fruit at the little grocery store on the corner, the same grocery store where Tommy bought flowers for Sarah the day he proposed. The old merchant who promised a bottle of Kentucky's best whiskey for when he returned, who always said he would keep it as long as necessary, just waved half-heartedly from afar. There were no questions about the war, no warm welcome that Tommy had imagined countless times during the long, cold months in the trenches. Something's different, Tommy thought, as he passed the Hendersons' house. The children who used to play in the garden, the same boys who would run to greet any military uniform with childish wonder in their eyes, now watched him warily from behind the white picket fence. No one ran towards him. No one asked to see their medals. No one asked if he had killed Nazis. An unsettling silence seemed to have taken over the entire street, as if everyone knew something he didn't, as if news had circulated, a secret shared among everyone except him. It was the kind of silence Tommy knew all too well, the silence that comes before the bomb hits, those few seconds of unnatural calm before the world explodes into chaos. Tommy swallowed. His hands, which had remained steady while holding a weapon under enemy fire, now began to shake. Not from fear, like in the trenches, but from an unknown anxiety, an indefinable fear that grew with each step that brought him closer to home. The feeling of being watched accompanied him. Curtains moved subtly as he passed. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed him, then quickly looked away when he looked back. He adjusted the collar of his uniform, checked that your medals were aligned correctly. He ran his hand through his hair, cut the day before, especially for this moment. Mechanical gestures, preparation rituals, as before a dangerous mission. Because in some incomprehensible way, his body already knew what his mind refused to accept. He was walking into another battle. As he turned the corner, he finally saw his house. The white paint, a little more worn than I remembered. Blue hydrangeas still bloomed in the small front garden, just like in the photographs he carried during the war. The American flag, hanging from the porch pole, swayed gently in the autumn breeze. On the surface, everything looked the same, but there was something more. A car. He didn't recognize parked on the sidewalk, different curtains on the windows, a children's bicycle leaning against the tree in the garden, small, almost insignificant details, but together they formed a disturbing picture that Tommy couldn't, or perhaps didn't want, to completely decipher. As he got closer, each step felt heavier than the last. The heart that survived bombings now threatened to fail with the proximity to home. The war had prepared Tommy for many horrors, but not for this moment, not for this suspicion that grew in his chest like a dark, suffocating stain. Because sometimes the worst injuries don't come from bullets or shrapnel. Sometimes they come from something as simple as mismatched curtains on familiar windows. And Tommy Sullivan was about to discover that some wounds can't be treated with bandages or field surgery. Some wounds change a man forever. Tommy stops in front of the white door, his door, the portal to everything that mattered. Suddenly you feel like a stranger, an intruder at the entrance to your own home. He watches his distorted reflection in the frosted glass of the door, a different man from the one who left almost 3 years ago, thinner, with deeper expression lines, eyes that see too much, a face hardened by the cruel reality of war. He removes his military cap carefully, as if he were in a sacred place. He runs a trembling hand through his closely cropped hair, following the ritual he learned to perform before every mission, every patrol, every moment of imminent danger. Take a deep breath. He counts to 3 in his head. 1, 2, 3, as he did before leaving the trench, before running across the open field under enemy fire. The war taught him that no matter how long you prepare, the moment of truth always comes too quickly. Your hand shakes as you ring the doorbell, a gesture so simple, so common, so immensely significant at this moment. The sound resonates inside the house, familiar and strange at the same time, like a distant echo from another life, another existence. Silence, and then steps. Not the distinctive click of Sarah's heels against the wooden floor that he knew so well. These steps are different, heavier, too light to be Sarah's. Your ears, trained to detect the slightest sound that could mean danger, pick up this difference immediately. Something inside him already knows. but his mind refuses to accept it. The golden doorknob, the same one he personally installed a week before he left, turns slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it too knows that what is about to happen will change everything. Tommy tries a smile, but his lips seem frozen. Years of military training had not prepared him for this moment. An icy sensation runs down your spine. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The same instinct that warned you about ambushes now screams inside you. The door opens, revealing not the face that filled his dreams for 937 nights, but a stranger. A man of approximately 35 years old, tall brown hair combed impeccably to the side, wearing a navy blue sweater with the Yale University emblem. He looks at Tommy with an expression of polite confusion, as if he's greeting an unexpected salesman. "Can I help?" the man asks, his voice calm, controlled, slightly interrogative. The words hit Tommy like bullets. He's standing in front of his own home, wearing his full uniform, his medals, including the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star, clearly visible, and this man, this stranger, asks if he can help, as if Tommy is the intruder, as if this piece of America he's bled for no longer belongs to him. Behind the man, Tommy glimpses the inside of the house. The walls that were pale yellow when you left are now painted a grayish blue. The couch where he and Sarah spent countless nights listening to the radio has been replaced with a more modern model. The photographs that decorated the main wall, including her wedding photo, Sarah radiant in her white dress, are no longer there. In their place, abstract modern paintings that you've never seen before. Imagine this moment. You're standing in front of your own home after surviving the unthinkable, only to discover that nothing is as it should be. What would you say? How would you react when you realize that the world you fought to protect has moved on without you? Leave your opinion in the comments. How would you face this moment of absolute break from reality? Tommy's mouth goes dry. The words just don't come. His eyes continue to scan the inside of the house, desperately searching for something familiar, something that confirms that this is still the place he risked his life for countless times. And then he sees her. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by the half-open door, is Sarah, not running into his arms as he had imagined so many times, not with tears of joy, not with her hair down like he remembered, but tied up in an elegant bun that she had never seen before. His face, the same face that kept him alive in his darkest moments, is pale, frozen in an expression Tommy has never seen before. Fear, guilt, shock. A small boy of approximately 3 years old, a child who did not exist when he left, a child who mathematically could not be his, holds the hem of her dress, partially hiding behind his mother's legs, watching the stranger at the door with the innocent curiosity of childhood. And in that instant, Tommy Sullivan's world, the world he fought, bled for, and almost died for, completely falls apart. Time seems to freeze. The outside world, the sounds of the street, the wind in the trees, the birds singing, everything disappears. For Tommy, there is only this moment, this unbearable reality that now appears before him with brutal clarity. The door is wide open now. The man in the navy blue sweater stands there, a physical presence between Tommy and the life he imagined awaited him. Sarah finally takes a few steps forward, her face a mask of contradictory emotions, shock, guilt, maybe even a trace of relief at finally facing the moment she must have feared for so long. "Tommy," she says, her voice barely above a whisper, as if seeing an apparition, a ghost returned from the other world. There is no joy in that voice, only disbelief, and something else, something that cuts deeper than any war wound, confirmation that she has moved on. The man looks back at Sarah, confusion evident on his face. "Do you know him?" he asks, his voice now cautious, defensive. "It's Thomas," Sarah responds, each word coming out as if it cost immense effort. My first husband. Two simple words that explain everything. Two words that transform the war hero into a relic of the past, a closed chapter, a sad story that people tell in hushed tones. The man now understands. His face pales. Are you Thomas Sullivan?" The question comes out loaded with a new type of recognition. Not the recognition due to a veteran, but the recognition of an impossible situation, a conflict of realities that no one expected to face. Tommy remains silent, unable to respond. His eyes remain fixed on Sarah, searching for some sign that this is all a terrible mistake, a nightmare from which he will soon awaken. "But you died," the man says, the words coming out almost like an accusation. The telegram. Sarah received the notification. Over 2 years ago. The ground seems to disappear beneath Tommy's feet. Dead. Officially. Dead? While he fought desperately to survive, to return home to her, the world had already buried him. He had already moved on. He had already made his wife a widow, and eventually another man's wife. His military backpack lands on the front step with a thud. The sound seems to momentarily wake him from his shock. 18 months of being tortured by the Gestapo, months in a German prison camp, surviving with only one hope, and the real fatal blow came from his own home, from the life he built. That now belongs to someone else. The little boy, sensing the tension in the air, hides further behind Sarah's legs. An innocent child who is not to blame for the situation, but whose mere existence is physical, indisputable proof that Sarah has really moved on, that she has created a new family, a new life where Tommy Sullivan was just a memory, a love lost to war. "They said you had died in Monte Cassino," says Sarah, her voice breaking with emotion. "I received the telegram from the war department. There was even a memorial ceremony at the church. Your name is on the monument in the central square, along with the others. Others dead, others who didn't return. The idea is so absurd, so surreal, that Tommy almost laughs. Almost. But there is no humor in this situation, just a cruel irony of fate. He survived being told he was dead, only to discover that his life, the life he knew, the life he fought for, actually died on that battlefield. Sarah's eyes, finally, meet Tommy's directly. There is no joy in them. There isn't the love he remembered that sustained him through his darkest times. There's only shock, confusion, and something worse than hate, pity. The same expression the nurses at the military hospital had when treating seriously injured soldiers, a distant compassion for something broken beyond repair. The vision Tommy has seen countless times in the trenches, Sarah running into his arms when he finally returns, fades like smoke. The reality is this door, this man, this woman, who is no longer his wife, this child who represents an entire life lived without him, and Captain Thomas Sullivan, decorated for exceptional bravery under enemy fire, now faces the battle for which no military training could have prepared him. Tommy's voice finally finds its way through the lump in his throat, a voice he barely recognizes, harsh, almost strangled by suppressed emotion. Sarah. It's just a name, a single word, but it carries the weight of thousands of unasked questions. How did this happen? Why? How long did you wait? Did our vows mean nothing? Were all the days I fought to get back to you in vain? Sarah takes a few more steps, placing herself partially between the man and Tommy, as if trying to create a barrier between two worlds that should never have met. His fingers nervously twist the ring on his left hand, not the ring Tommy gave him, but a new one, a symbol of promises made to another man. "Tommy, you're alive," she says, not as an exclamation of joy, but as the realization of a terrible mistake, a mistake that would now cause pain to everyone involved. No one knew. The telegram arrived in March 1943. It said you had been killed in action at Monte Cassino. There was a letter from your commander. Details about how you... His voice cracks. Memories of a morning that now seems to have been in vain, of tears shed for a man who, surprisingly, is alive and standing before her. "The telegram," she continues, her voice gaining firmness as she clings to the facts, to the explanation she now desperately needs to give. "They said you had been killed, that there was no body to send home, that you had been buried there, with military honors." The man now steps forward, placing a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. A simple, automatic, intimate gesture, the kind of gesture Tommy used to make, the kind of gesture that is now the privilege of another. "Are you hers first husband?" the man asks, his voice a mix of incredulity and something akin to fear. He now fully understands the situation, his eyes darting between Tommy, Sarah, and the child who now watches the scene with growing confusion. Tommy doesn't answer the man's question. His eyes remain fixed on Sarah. "What happened to me?" he asks finally. "They said I was dead and you just believed it?" The hardness in Tommy's voice surprises even himself. This was not how I imagined this moment. During the long months of captivity, it wasn't anger that kept him alive. It was love, hope, the knowledge that she would be waiting. "I waited, Tommy," Sarah replies, tears finally streaming down her face. "I waited over a year. I wore black every day. I visited his empty grave in the cemetery. I cried until I fell ill. His mother, She came to live with me for 6 months because she was afraid of what I might do. The words hit Tommy like physical blows. The image of Sarah mourning, grieving. For him, while he was still alive, fighting to return home, is almost unbearable. "What happened to you?" Sarah asks, her voice regaining some strength. "Where have you been all this time?" Tommy feels the ground disappear beneath his feet. How to explain the hell of the last 2 years? How do you put into words the things you saw, the things you suffered, the things you were forced to do to survive? "I was captured," he says simply, "at the Battle of Monte Cassino. I was in a German prison camp for 18 months. When the Allies finally freed us, it took time to come back. If you knew that someone you loved deeply had moved on, built a new life believing you were dead, what would you do? Would you fight for what was rightfully yours, or accept that destiny had written a different ending? Share your opinion in the comments. What should a man like Tommy Sullivan do in this impossible time? The man, who Tommy now realizes must be Sarah's current husband, looks at the floor, visibly uncomfortable. There's empathy on his face, mixed with the obvious fear of losing everything he's built. "I'm Richard," he says finally, as if feeling the need to formally introduce himself in this absolutely surreal situation. Richard Harmon, professor of history at Yale University, a teacher, not a soldier, a man who spent the war years in classrooms, not trenches, a man who slept in a bed every night, not on the frozen ground of Europe, a man who now sleeps next to Sarah, Tommy's Sarah, every night. "When we met," Sarah says, her voice almost a whisper, "it was at the memorial for the soldiers lost at Monte Cassino. Richard lost his brother in the same battle where we thought you—" Tommy can taste the bitter taste of bile rising in his throat. The irony is unbearable. While he fought in the depths of hell to return home to her, Sarah found comfort in the arms of another man, a man who was connected to the same battle that allegedly took his life. "How long?" Tommy asks, the words coming out like rough stones. "How long after the telegram until you—" Can't finish the question, can't force the words out. 1 year and 3 months, Sarah replies, her eyes downcast. "We got married in July 1944. William was born in April last year." William. The boy has a name now, a name Tommy didn't choose, a life that began while he was still struggling to survive, while he was still dreaming of the moment he would return home, to Sarah, to the future they had planned together. Tommy Sullivan survived the war only to discover that his true battle was just beginning. In the living room that was once his, Tommy now sits like a stranger, a visitor displaced in time. The feeling is surreal. The sofas are arranged differently. The curtains are not the same, even the smell of the house has changed. The details he obsessively memorized during the long months of captivity, the arrangement of furniture, the exact location of each photograph, the grandfather clock that belonged to his grandfather, were replaced, rearranged, or simply eliminated. The truth is revealed in painful fragments as Sarah, with a trembling voice and downcast eyes, explains what happened after the War Department telegram. Officially, he was declared killed in action on March 18, 1943, during the bloody Battle of Monte Cassino. How Colonel Jenkins, the same man who once praised Tommy for his exceptional courage, sent a letter detailing his final hours, describing how he heroically led his unit against a heavily defended enemy position, allowing dozens of American soldiers to escape with their lives. "They sent their medals," says Sarah, pointing to a small box on the shelf, kept as a relic of a man who no longer existed. There was a ceremony in the city center. The mayor gave a speech. His name was engraved on the monument to the fallen. The reality that Tommy now faces is relentless. While he resisted torture, dreaming of reunion, his country, his city, his wife, everyone moved on. Everyone buried him. Everyone accepted his death as a fait accompli. The absurd truth is that Tommy Sullivan died to the world, even as his heart stubbornly continued to beat. "What really happened to you?" Richard asks, his tone now less defensive, more genuinely interested in the story of the man whose death unwittingly made him Sarah's new husband. Tommy is reluctant, the words refusing to come out. How to explain hell? How do you describe to these people sitting comfortably in a warm room the endless nights of brutal interrogations, teeth pulled out one by one for information he refused to provide, the hunger that gnawed at the insides until the hallucination became a refuge, the cellmates who died one after the other, some begging for an end, others simply giving up in silence? "I've been captured," he says finally, the words coming out harshly from a throat that feels full of sand. "They left me for dead, but I was in a prison camp near Dresden when the Allies advanced. The Germans moved us further east. We were liberated by the Russians in February this year. It took time to get back. Time. Such a small word to describe the endless months of bureaucracy, military hospitals, interrogations to ensure he hadn't been compromised, identification procedures, precarious transportation across a devastated Europe. Time during which Tommy clung to the only thing that mattered, returning home, to Sarah, to the life he had left on hold. We had no way of doing, Sarah says, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. I waited for you, Tommy. I swear to God I waited. I wore black for over a year. I went to the cemetery every Sunday. Your mother, she was so worried about me that she came to live here for 6 months. She was afraid Sarah doesn't finish the sentence, but she doesn't have to. Tommy can visualize it. Sarah devastated by the news of his death, perhaps contemplating following the same path, unable to imagine a life without him. The same Sarah who is now another man's wife, mother of a child that is not his. When I met Richard, she continues after a long silence, it was at the second memorial for the fallen at Monte Cassino. He had lost his younger brother in the same battle. We understood each other in a way other people couldn't. We had both lost someone there. The irony is almost unbearable. Sarah and Richard united in mourning for men supposedly killed in the same battle where Tommy had actually been. Captured, fate with its wicked sense of humor, using the same tragedy to destroy one marriage and create another. Little William, who had been watching silently from the corner of the room, now approaches cautiously, his childish curiosity overcoming his initial fear. He stares at the medals on Tommy's chest with wide eyes, fascinated by the gleam of the metal, completely oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. "Are you a real soldier?" asks the child, her thin voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room like an unexpected ray of light through storm clouds. Tommy looks at the boy, dark hair like Sarah's, intelligent eyes like his father's, this new father that destiny has given him. An innocent child who is not to blame for the impossible situation created by war, by chaos, by mistakes made by people and institutions far beyond his small world. "Yes," Tommy responds finally, his voice softer than at any time since he entered this house that is no longer his. I'm a soldier." "Like Uncle Michael?" asks William, unknowingly referring to Richard's brother who died at Monte Cassino, the same man whose death created the connection that would eventually lead Sarah into Richard's arms. Richard gently interjects, "Yes, like Uncle Michael. Captain Sullivan fought in the same battle as my brother." Tommy realizes the most painful truth of all. He fought like a lion to return to a life that no longer existed, while he stubbornly clung to the memories of his home, his wife, his future. The world had moved on without him, inexorable as the tide, indifferent to his dreams and promises. Sarah, now more composed, serves tea in cups that Tommy doesn't recognize. A simple domestic ritual that somehow underscores the complete strangeness of the situation. This woman he knew better than himself is now a stranger, living a life he doesn't share, serving tea to the ghost of his past and the man who took her place. "What are you going to do now?" asks Sarah. Finally, the question that has been hanging in the air from the moment the door opened, from the instant 3 separate lives collided in this living room in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's the question Tommy also asks himself as he looks at the shattered fragments of the future he's imagined for so long. Tommy stands, the heavy silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, a clock he doesn't recognize, which marks the time of a life that has gone on without him. Every line on his face, every visible and invisible scar, every fiber of his being carries the weight of the impossible decision he now faces. Legally, he knows the situation is clear. Sarah is still his wife. The marriage to Richard, which took place while he was still alive, is not technically valid. All it would take was a visit to the local courthouse, a few documents signed, and Sarah would be legally obligated to recognize him as her lawful husband. The law would be on your side. But as his eyes sweep around the room, resting momentarily on the family photographs on the bookshelf, Sarah and Richard on their wedding day, William on his first birthday, moments from a life built in his absence, Tommy understands that some battles cannot be won by force or law. He watches little William, who is now playing absent-mindedly with a wooden cart at Richard's feet, an innocent child in the middle of chaos created by adults, by nations at war, by bureaucratic errors that turned a living man into a ghost. A child who would grow up in a divided home if Tommy decided to fight for what is legally his. "I could demand my rights," Tommy says finally, his calm voice contrasting with the storm in his eyes. "Legally, Sarah is still my wife." Richard visibly pales. Sarah holds her breath. The tension in the room is so thick it seems to have physical weight. "But I didn't fight for this country. I didn't survive that hell, to come back and destroy the lives of the people I love," Tommy continues, each word costing visible effort. "I fought for something that no longer exists." He turns to Sarah, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since entering the house. For a brief moment, they are both transported back to the days of their youth, to the moment they met at the church party, to their first kiss under the oak tree in the city park, to the night he proposed under a starry summer sky. Sarah tries to touch his arm, an instinctive gesture, an echo of intimacy that no longer exists. Tommy recoils slightly, not out of anger, but because he knows that touch could shatter the resolve he's trying to build. "The Tommy you knew," he says, the words coming out like heavy stones, "died in that field." Maybe the telegram was right after all. It is a metaphorical death, but no less real for that. The optimistic young man who went to war, full of patriotism and dreams for the future, actually died in the trenches, in the prison camps, in the long, endless nights of pain and despair. The man who returned is just a shadow, a ghost who now needs to find a new place in a world that no longer recognizes him. If you were faced with this impossible decision, what would you do? Would you fight for your legal rights, for the woman you still love? Or would you accept that sometimes the greatest act of love is to give up what is most precious to us? Share in the comments how you would face this moral dilemma that has no right answer. Richard, visibly touched by the unexpected nobility of this man who has every right to hate, to fight, to demand the return of what is legally his, takes a step forward. "Captain Sullivan," he says, using his military title as a sign of respect, "I can't imagine what you've been through, and I can't pretend to completely understand your situation, but I want you to know that—" "You don't need to say anything," Tommy interrupts, unable to bear this man's gratitude, or even worse, his pity. "You didn't take anything from me. The war took it. The Germans took it. The War Department's damn mistake took it." War, Tommy realizes, doesn't end when the guns fall silent. For men like him, the battle just changes shape. It becomes an internal struggle, a war against memories that cannot be erased, against a reality that refuses to fit into the dreams that kept him alive. Sarah, silent tears streaming down her face, finally finds words. "What are you going to do, Tommy? Where are you going?" It's a question he can barely answer himself. All the plans he made, all the dreams he cultivated during those long months of captivity, they all orbited around this house, this woman, this life that no longer exists. "The army offered me a position in Washington," he says finally. "Something administrative. They have a program for men like me, men like him, broken veterans, physically whole enough to work, but carrying wounds that no doctor can treat. Men who return to find their lives irrevocably altered, their places taken, their futures redirected by forces beyond their control. I'm going there next week," he continues, the decision solidifying as the words come out. "I'm going to file the divorce papers before I leave." The word divorce feels strange on his lips, a concept he never imagined applying to his relationship with Sarah. They had sworn, "Till death do us part," and in a sense, death did tear them apart. The presumed death of Tommy, the death of the future they had planned together, the slow, inexorable death of the life they knew. "I don't want anything from the house, no pension, nothing like that," he adds quickly. "I just want you to be happy, Sarah. I just want you to find the peace that I probably will never find." Tommy realizes, with crystal clear and painful clarity, that the hardest battle is not against enemies with weapons, but against the relentless reality that cannot be changed by strength, by courage, or by determination. Some wars simply cannot be won, only survived. He looks around the room one last time, memorizing every detail, not as it was before, but as it is now, so that he can finally accept this new reality and move on. His gaze rests briefly on little William, innocent in his play, protected by childish ignorance of the magnitude of the adult tragedy unfolding around him. "Take good care of him," Tommy says, addressing both Sarah and Richard. "He deserves to grow up in a happy home." With these words, Captain Thomas Sullivan, decorated, hero, resilient survivor, man displaced in his own country, rises to face his greatest challenge, finding new purpose in a world that has already forgotten him. 3 days later, Tommy is staying in a small room at the Arlington Hotel in downtown Bridgeport. From his 4th-story window, he looks out over the city he once called home, lights shining in houses where intact families dine together, cars passing on the streets, life continuing its normal course, undisturbed and indifferent to the plight of a single man. Spread out on the cheap hotel bed are his medals, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, the Bronze Star for bravery, the Distinguished Service Cross for exceptional heroism, metallic symbols of valor and sacrifice that now seem strangely empty, devoid of real meaning. What value do these decorations have when they cannot buy back lost time, when they cannot restore the life that was taken not by a bullet, but by the simple and relentless march of time? Tommy takes one of the medals, turning it over in his hands, watching as the light from the lamp reflects off the polished surface. During war, these honors represented something tangible, recognition of sacrifice, validation of suffering, symbols that the price paid had meaning. Now they seemed like just worthless pieces of metal, unable to warm the cold that had settled permanently in his chest since he opened that door on Harbor Drive. He realizes a bitter truth that no patriotic speech, no victory parade, no monument to the fallen will ever mention. For many like him, the war does not end when the guns fall silent. Peace treaties are signed, flags are raised in celebration, civilians celebrate in the streets. But for the returning soldiers, especially those who, like Tommy, have lost not just years but entire identities, war only changes shape. The real battle, Tommy realizes as he watches the lights of the city that is no longer his, begins when a soldier tries to reclaim a life that the world has already rewrote without him. It is a silent fight, fought not on battlefields but in lonely hotel rooms, in veterans' affairs offices, in nightmares that do not relent with the dawn, in jolts when hearing a door slam, in cold sweats during storms that sound too much like distant artillery. While some celebrate the regained peace, others, like Tommy, discover that the greatest sacrifice was not what they made on the battlefield, but what they lost while they were away. Homes, families, identities, futures, and perhaps most cruel of all, the ability to fit back into a world that now seems as foreign as the foreign countries where they fought. Tommy looks at the newspaper folded on the table, headlines celebrating victory, articles about the reconstruction of Europe, editorials about the new era of American prosperity that is ushering in. Somewhere on the inside pages, perhaps there will be a small note about the challenges faced by returning veterans, but it will be brief, superficial, unable to capture the depth of the chasm that men like him now face. In a world moving forward, heroes are often left behind, carrying the burden of their empty victories alone. This is the truth that no history book will adequately record, that for every soldier who returns to hugs and feasts and a life resumed, there are others who return to find that their lives have been irrevocably changed, that their places have been filled, that time, merciless in its steady march, does not pause for wars or prisoners or absent heroes. Tommy gets up, approaching the window. Below, in the central square, stands the monument to the fallen of war, a bronze statue of a soldier, eternal in his stone vigilance. And there, among the names etched into the granite, is his own, Captain Thomas J. Sullivan, sacrificed at Monte Cassino, 1943, a memorial to a man who did not die, but whose life nevertheless came to an end in those Italian mountains. There is a painful irony that is not lost on Tommy. He needs to be dead to live. As long as her name remains on that monument, as long as her death remains an official truth, Sarah can continue her new life, her new marriage, without legal complications or social stigma. William can grow with the stability he deserves. The lie that caused so much pain now becomes the necessary foundation for the happiness of others. And maybe, Tommy thinks, as he watches the stars slowly appear in the Connecticut night sky, maybe there's a certain peace in leaving that young Tommy Sullivan on the battlefield, in accepting that the man who returned is someone different, someone who needs to carve out a new identity, find a new purpose, maybe even a new name, because some wounds do not heal with medication or surgery. Some losses cannot be compensated with medals or pensions. Some sacrifices remain invisible, unrecognized, known only to those who carry them silently within themselves. This is the final lesson, the blunt truth that Tommy Sullivan now understands with a clarity that cuts like steel. The true price of war is not measured in dollars spent, bullets fired, or even lives lost. It is measured in altered futures, in abandoned dreams, in fragmented identities that will never completely come together again. And as Tommy surveys the city that once was his, he wonders how many others like him there are. Living ghosts wandering in America that celebrates victory without fully understanding its cost. Unsung heroes, fighting unseen battles long after the official guns have fallen silent. What happened to Captain Thomas Sullivan after that night at the hotel? The story few know reveals the true meaning of courage, not just bravery under enemy fire, but the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life when everything you knew was lost. Tommy left Bridgeport the next morning, just as he promised. Before leaving, he made 2 visits, one to a lawyer's office where he signed the initial divorce papers, formally, renouncing any claim to the house and property he once shared with Sarah. The second visit was to the local cemetery, where an empty grave marked with her name had been Sarah's place of mourning for 2 long years. There, in a moment of profound symbolism that only he witnessed, Tommy buried his medals, burying not only the symbols of his heroism, but also the man he had been. Officially, in military records, Captain Sullivan's status was corrected from killed in action to returned veteran, a mere bureaucratic change that did nothing to capture the devastating complexity of his situation. But in Bridgeport, by a silent, collective decision that no one ever openly discussed, his name remained on the monument to the fallen. The town tacitly agreed to maintain the fiction necessary to protect Sarah, Richard, and little William from the scandal and legal complications that the full truth would bring. Tommy accepted the job in Washington, D.C. at the newly formed Department of Veterans Affairs. There he found an unexpected purpose to help other men like him, soldiers returning to homes that no longer existed, to families who had moved on, to a country that celebrated their courage but often ignored their ongoing suffering. Over the years, he built a reputation as a tireless defender of the rights of veterans, especially those who, like him, had been presumed dead and then resurrected, a phenomenon more common than most people realized in the chaotic mess of the war's final years. Tommy never married again, never returned to Bridgeport, but through his work, through the hundreds of veterans' lives he helped rebuild, he found a form of redemption and purpose that transcended his personal loss. What would you do in Tommy's place? Would you fight for what was legally yours, or like him? Would you understand that some battles cannot be won by force or law? That sometimes true heroism lies in giving up what we love most? Leave your opinion in the comments. What truly defines courage in times of peace? This is just one of thousands of true stories that never made it into official history books. How many heroes have returned to find only emptiness, to discover that the lives they defended had gone on without them? How many have had to rebuild entire identities from scratch, finding purpose in unexpected places after their original dreams were shattered not by enemy bullets, but by the simple, relentless march of time? If you know a veteran, value their stories. Understand that for many of them, the war never really ended. It just changed form, turning into internal battles fought away from the public eye. Share this video so more people understand the true cost of heroism, the invisible sacrifice that continues long after the victory parades end and the headlines celebrate peace. And don't miss our next episode, where we reveal what happened when, 20 years later, Sarah's son, William Harmon, now a young man of 23, discovered the truth about the man whose place his father took. This young man's search for the real Captain Sullivan and the encounter that changed 2 generations is a story of reconciliation and healing you won't want to miss. Watch next Friday, exclusively on this channel. Because the true story of war does not end when the guns fall silent. It continues in the lives of those who fought, those who waited, and those, like Tommy Sullivan, who had to find the courage to carry on when everything they loved was lost. This is the real story of America, not just of its victories, but of their human cost, not just of its heroism on the battlefield, but of the quiet courage it took to rebuild lives torn apart by conflict. Captain Thomas Sullivan's story is more than an account of war. It is a powerful testament to what it means to be truly human in the face of the most devastating circumstances. The decisions we make when faced with loss, involuntary betrayal, and displacement reveal our true essence. Tommy chose the most difficult path, giving up what legally belonged to him to preserve the happiness of those he loved. This silent nobility, this courage that does not appear in headlines or receive medals, represents true American heroism. You now carry this powerful story. Every time you share this content, more people understand the true sacrifice of our veterans. Your like amplifies this vital message and honors the memory of those who returned to homes that no longer existed. Enjoy now and transform the recognition of these forgotten heroes. What would you do in Captain Sullivan's place? Your answer reveals a lot about your values and worldview. Your voice enriches our collective understanding and creates deep connections between people who have never met. Share your perspective on this impossible moral dilemma. In the comments, you are now part of this community that preserves America's untold truths, the essential narratives that shape who we are as a nation and as people. Subscribe to this channel and become the guardian of these stories that official history ignores. There is another, even more surprising story waiting for you. Click on the next video and dive in with me in this shocking revelation about another American hero whose life was completely transformed by a single defining moment. The revelations that await will completely change your perception of courage, sacrifice, and redemption.